One of the greatest things about startups is startup equity. Startup equity is one of the big reasons why taking a risk around a startup or on an unproven idea is worth it. It's also one of the greatest sources of true wealth creation, even if you're not an entrepreneur. However, if you're a founder, it can be really hard to actually figure out how to divvy up this equity. Not even just with early employees or investors, but also your co-founders. So in this episode, I'm going to walk you through the 3 principles you actually need to know to divvy up startup equity in the right way so that everyone gets an equitable amount of the upside. Intro. What's up, everybody? Welcome to Unstoppable. I'm TK, and on this channel, I help SaaS startup founders like you navigate the path to the next stage of growth, navigate the path to product market fit, $1 million ARR and beyond. So if you're new to our community, welcome. Be sure to hit the subscribe button and that bell icon because I bring you an episode like this every Sunday, Wednesday, and Friday with the TK energy. Now, if you're a startup founder and you're navigating this path on how to actually divvy up startup equity, maybe you're just starting the SaaS business and you and your co-founder are starting to figure out how do you even split up the equity between the two of you. In this episode, in this video, I'm going to walk you through exactly the 3 principles I applied and I learned when I was a venture-backed CEO, when I was a solo founder and I had to bring on early employees, bring on investors and advisors and give them equity to incentivize them. Here's the 3 principles that I follow. So if you're excited to dig in, go ahead and smash that like button and let's get right into it. Now, the first principle is what are the 2 components that I think about the most? I'm going to explain everything through this one graph. And I know there's a lot here, but I'll walk you through it one by one. So principle number 1 is there's this 2 things that matter the most when it comes to thinking about equity. The first thing is the x-axis, which is the amount of equity. The second thing is the amount of risk that the person is taking on. And the way this graph goes is that the more risk that they're taking on, then the more equity that they should get. Now, obviously, it's not just as simple as that, because sometimes someone takes on risk, but they also take on a sufficient amount of cash compensation. So if someone's coming in and they're getting paid at market rate, then you actually subtract that out from the risk because you're de-risking them with cash. At the same time, if someone is going above and beyond in terms of their contribution, even though they've taken a certain amount of risk and they've taken the market rate or maybe even not a market rate, if they've gone above and beyond in their contribution, then they should get more equity. So I clean it up simply as there's the amount of equity you're giving in the bottom. And over here, you essentially think about how much risk are they taking on? How much contribution are they giving minus the amount of cash they're taking out? And that gives you a certain amount of understanding on really how much equity is fair for them to get. So risk is on one side, risk and contribution minus cash. And the other side is the amount of equity. And the more risk that they're taking on, the more equity they should get. If they start to give even more contribution and go above and beyond, the more equity they should get. But then if they are paid at a fair market value, maybe they should get a little bit less equity. So those are the 2 levers that you really want to think about it as. And what I found as a startup founder was when I thought about it in these 2 levers, I was able to even explain to people or have a constructive discussion with others on how we should think about startup equity. So that's principle number 1. Think about risk on one side and the amount of equity on the other side. And if they are going above and beyond in contribution, then the more equity. But if they're taking cash out, then maybe a little bit less equity. The second thing to think about, the second principle around this are all the key players that you'll have to optimize for when it comes to assigning equity. You think about equity is essentially this one pie. It's this pizza pie that you have. And on one hand, your job as a startup founder is to make this pie as big as possible. Meaning, if you own 100% of this very tiny pie that doesn't taste very good, it's not worth it. But if you own even 1% of a massive pie that tastes amazing and is the best pizza in the world, then it's really worth it for everyone involved. So what you really want to be doing is optimizing the pie so that the value goes up. It's a delicious pie, it's a big pie, but you also, everyone owns a piece of it that's appropriate for the amount that they've contributed and the amount of risk they've taken on. Now, there's a few key players that come into this. All right, so let's walk through them. At the top, you have founders. Then you have investors. And then you have the early employees, and then you have advisors. And you'll notice I kind of put them appropriately in terms of the risk contribution minus cash access. Meaning founders take on the most amount of risk, have the biggest contribution, and in the early stages take out the least amount of cash. Investors take on the greatest amount of risk because they actually have people that they're accountable for, and they're taking on all this financial risk on a very early idea to actually support you. So they take on a huge amount of risk as well. And then you have employees who typically are paid, maybe not at market rate, but they are paid. And based on that, they take on a certain amount of risk, they have a certain amount of contribution minus the cash that they're being paid out, so they get an appropriate amount of equity. And then lastly, you have advisors who typically don't get paid, or maybe get paid a very small amount, but do take on some level of risk in terms of time or their reputation, putting their name next to yours. So you have them there as well. These are all the people that are involved that you'll have to give out equity to by and large. Now, before I go into each of these people and how much you should give and how you should think about it in the spectrum and why I place them in certain ways, let me just pause here for a second. If you're starting to see how this starts to come together, there's this idea of risk versus the amount of equity to give, and the more contribution they have, maybe the more equity that you give, but the more market rate and cash you're giving, maybe the less equity that you get. If you're starting to see how this all starts to come together, and I can use a framework like this, go ahead and smash that like button for that YouTube algorithm. And if you're really excited about this, give me a yes in the comments below. Also, if you are in that stage where you're building out your SaaS business, be sure to check out my 10-point SaaS business checklist. It's a great resource for you to actually flesh out your SaaS idea as you're thinking about how to put some structure to it. I'll link to it below and tell you more about it at the end of this video, but let's keep going. Now, let's take care of how typically what you give in terms of equity. Now, these are guidelines. They're not perfect. They're not absolute. Details do matter and it may vary. I'm going to give you that caveat. Every circumstance is different, but there are some broad strokes. Let's start with founders. If you are a founder and you and your co-founder are thinking about how to divvy up the equity around the company, my default rule is that it should be 50-50. Unless one of the founders is taking on significantly less risk or one of the founders is significantly taking on more risk. For example, if one of the founders is not quitting their job and the other founder is quitting their job, then the risk may be different. Maybe you don't want to do 50-50. However, if both founders are in it to win it and they're saying, okay, we're both going to part-time this and we're going to both work on this and we're both going to allocate a certain number of hours on this, then it should be 50-50 and it should be a no-brainer. So if you're having the conversation with your founder, your co-founder, and you're starting to figure out whether it's 50-50 or slightly different, thinking about the risk spectrum and the contribution spectrum minus the cash spectrum versus equity is a great way to start the conversation, but try to go for 50-50. Now, there was an article by Jason Lemkin on SaaStr about how it's not always 50-50 for some of the most successful companies. And he's right, it's absolutely okay if it's not 50-50, as long as everyone's good. What you don't want to do is negotiate real hard with your co-founder in the beginning stages, and everyone's got a bad feeling about it. It's just not how you want to start off this marriage, which is why my default bid is 50-50, unless really there's a difference in the risk criteria for either of the people involved. Once you do that, then you go into investors. Investors, again, this varies wildly, but by and large, you're talking about 20% equity on every round that you take on. Sometimes it can go to 30% if it's super early stage or if it's a bad round that you're doing. Generally speaking, venture investors want to take 20% of the company on every round that they do. You can negotiate either way depending on how good of a negotiator you are and how much traction you have and the numbers. I do have an entire episode on how to think about fundraising as you're starting a SaaS business. You can check out that episode here where I talk about what I would do around fundraising and raising venture capital if I were to start a SaaS business today. Now, then you get into employees. Generally speaking, it's 3% or less. And I'm talking 3% for extreme rock star VPs that you're bringing on that are going to be game changing for the business in the early stages. So generally speaking, you're probably looking at less than 1% for early stage employees. But if you're talking VPs or C-level executives that you're bringing on early on, then you can go up to 3% in terms of equity. Once you have that, actually, one more thing on employees. One of the things you may also be wondering is what do your first few employees even look like beyond your co-founder? If you're interested in that, I did a video on if I were to start a SaaS business today, who are the 4 first employees that I would bring on. You can check that video out over here. I'll also link to it below. You don't have to go it right now. I'll link to all the videos down below so you can go to it, but you should check out that video as well if you think about who these first set of employees should be. And then lastly, advisors. Advisors, these are strategic advisors that you're bringing on that are gonna help you along in growing your business. They could be domain experts, they could be people that are coaches, they could be consultants. And what they do is they come in and they charge you a certain amount, plus they take a certain amount of equity. And I always liked it when I gave them equity because I knew that they had long-term skin in the game beyond whatever cash I was compensating them with. And for those kind of people, it's generally less than 1%. It's anywhere from 0.01% to 1%, depending on how strategic that advisor is, and really how much skin of theirs you want in the game, commensurate to the amount of risk and contribution that they're taking on. If the advisor happens to be highly coveted, then you want to give them a good amount of equity so you get their attention, otherwise they probably won't do it. If it's just a normal person, maybe you want to give a token amount and see how they do and grow it over time. The last piece I'll mention around startup equity is you should always have a vesting period. Now, you can go into a lot more detail on vesting periods and cliffs and the legal implications of that. I encourage you to talk to your software attorney around that. However, at the bare minimum, they should have a 12-month cliff and a 4-year vesting period. Meaning, say your co-founder and you do 50-50. Even for your co-founder and you should have a 12-month cliff and a 4-year vesting. What that means is that with the 12-month cliff, if your co-founder leaves the business in less than 12 months, within the first 12 months of you guys starting the company, they walk away with no equity, which is what's fair because it takes a long while to build startups. You don't want to give 50% of your company to that co-founder that stuck around for 3 months and you built the business for 10 years, which is why everyone involved across all of these people should have a 12-month cliff. On top of that, once they get past those 12 months, they shouldn't get the entire 50% equity. It should build year over year over a 4-year period. That way, if they leave 2 years in and then you go build the business for 10 years, they get a fair amount of that equity instead of the full 50%. So now you know how to think about equity, at least through some sort of a framework. Principle number 1, think about risk that they're taking on, plus the contribution they're giving, minus the cash they're taking out. And that's commensurate to the amount of equity that you should give. Second principle, you should think about the key players you would give equity to: founders, investors, employees, and advisors. And principle number 3, there's some general guidelines that you can follow on how much equity to give for each group of people, where they fall in the risk versus equity line. Now you know how to think about startup equity. If you got value from this video, be sure to smash that like button for the YouTube algorithm. Also means the world to me and my team. Also, if you are building out your SaaS business, if you're in that early stages, be sure to check out my 10-point SaaS checklist. You can follow the link below or just go to tkkader.com/SaaS-checklist. In it, I will walk you through the exact questions to ask yourself to strengthen and validate your core SaaS idea. Also, I drop a video like this every Sunday, Wednesday, and Friday to help SaaS founders like you navigate to the next stage of growth. So be sure to hit that subscribe button and that bell icon. If you have a friend that's also a founder that would get value from this video or my channel, please share it with them. It would mean the world to us. And lastly, remember, everyone needs a strategy for their life and their business, but when you are with us, yours is going to be unstoppable. I'm TK, and I'll see you in the next episode.